Ever feel like you're playing chess and the enemy's decided to whip out the poker chips instead?
Yeah, like suddenly the rules of the game have changed.
Exactly. And that's military strategy in a nutshell, trying to outmaneuver an opponent who might not even be playing by the same rulebook. And when it comes to breaking down those strategic mind games, there's really no one better to turn to than the OG himself, Carl von Clausewitz.
Right. He's the go-to even now, all these years later.
Absolutely. His masterpiece, On War, it's practically required reading for, well, anyone who's serious about military strategy. And we know you guys, our listeners, you're the real deal.
Definitely not your armchair general crowd.
So today we're strapping on those analytical helmets and doing a deep dive into chapters 20 and 21.
Buckle up, because we're tackling diversions and invasions.
Clausewitz style. And you know, what I find fascinating is how, even though Clausewitz was writing way back in the 19th century, his insights are still so relevant today. I mean, warfare has changed so much, but those core strategic concepts, they still hold up.
It's true. The tech, the scale, everything's different now. But at its core, it's still that clash of wills, that constant struggle for advantage. And Clausewitz just cuts through all the noise to those timeless principles.
Exactly. So let's jump right into chapter 20, where he really digs into this idea of diversions. And, you know, we might use that word kind of casually for any kind of feint or distraction in everyday language.
Just to throw someone off their game a bit.
Right. But Clausewitz, he's not messing around. He gets very specific. He's talking about a deliberate attack, not just to confuse the enemy, but to pull their forces away from where you want to strike.
It's about exploiting their reactions, almost like setting a trap at the back door while you're sneaking in the front.
Perfect analogy. It's not about winning that smaller engagement. It's about strategically shifting the entire battlefield.
Forcing them to react in a way that plays into your hands. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Clausewitz argues that a successful diversion, it's not about brute force, it's about leverage.
So less about overwhelming the enemy and more about, like, outsmarting them.
Exactly. You want the impact of your diversion to be bigger than the resources you actually commit to it. You want the enemy to overreact, to tie down a larger force than they need to because they think it's more significant than it actually is.
It's about playing mind games, keeping them guessing. So with that in mind, how do you choose the right target for that kind of misdirection? Because Clausewitz gives some really fascinating examples. Like he talks about attacking a heavily fortified spot just to draw the enemy in.
Oh yeah, make them think you're going for a key stronghold.
Or hitting a supply depot,
Yeah.
disrupting their logistics, throwing their whole system into chaos. And he even brings up the idea of targeting major cities.
Especially the enemy's capital. Talk about a high-stakes gamble.
Right. Can you imagine the kind of pressure that puts on a leader? Suddenly, you're not just dealing with a military objective. There's this whole psychological dimension at play.
It's huge. And that's something Clausewitz was very aware of. He understood that war isn't just about moving troops around. It's about influencing perceptions, about eroding morale. And he takes it even further. He even mentions supporting rebellions within enemy territory.
Talk about stirring the pot. That
Yeah.
adds a whole other layer of complexity to it.
It does, and it really underscores his point that diversions, they aren't just these isolated military maneuvers. They're deeply intertwined with political and social dynamics. It's like you said, suddenly you're playing a whole different game.
It's like a multi-level game of chess where every move has these cascading consequences. But, and this is important, Clausewitz isn't saying that diversions are always the answer. He's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, he doesn't just hand us this playbook and say, go forth and divert. He's very clear about the fact that there are risks involved.
Right. It's not a guaranteed win.
Yeah, and that's where his emphasis on adaptability comes in. He provides this framework for evaluating whether a diversion is the right call in a given situation, because its effectiveness depends on a lot of factors. He talks about relative strength. Can you effectively tie down a larger enemy force with a smaller one? And then there's the strategic importance of your target.
Right. Picking a target that the enemy feels obligated to defend, even if they suspect it might be a trap.
Exactly. And even then, there's no guarantee. Clausewitz was very aware of how a diversion could backfire, how it could actually end up hurting your overall strategy. He cautions against carelessly pulling new territories or populations into the conflict, because that can create a whole new set of problems you didn't anticipate.
Almost like you're adding fuel to the fire, but you can't control which way the flames are going to spread.
Exactly. He uses the 1799 North Holland and 1809 Walcheren expeditions as examples of that. Really ambitious moves, but ultimately they became cautionary tales.
A good reminder that even the most well-planned diversion can have unintended consequences. So knowing all that, what makes for a truly favorable environment for a diversion, according to Clausewitz? When do those stars align, strategically speaking?
Well, he lays out a few key conditions. First off, you need to have enough forces to commit to the diversion without weakening your main effort.
Makes sense. You don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul.
Right. Second, like we talked about, that target has to be something the enemy feels compelled to defend high-value resources, symbolic locations, things that hit them where it hurts.
It's about knowing which buttons to push. What else?
Well, if there's already unrest or rebellion brewing in enemy territory, that's like a freebie. It's a chance to exploit existing tensions to your advantage. And finally, if you can pull off a diversion that not only distracts the enemy, but also allows you to seize resources that'll actually help sustain your war effort,
Then you're really hitting the strategic jackpot.
you got it. It's not just about causing chaos, it's about tilting the scales in your favor.
It's about playing the long game. So we've talked about the why of diversions, but what about the how? Clausewitz gets into the nitty-gritty of different types of diversions
Yeah.
and how to actually execute them. He talks about three main types, right?
He does. There's the straightforward diversion, which is essentially a genuine attack just designed to suck the enemy in. Then you've got diversions disguised as much larger movements, kind of like a bluff in poker. The goal there is to create this illusion of overwhelming force, making the enemy react to what they think is a major threat.
So it's psychological warfare as much as anything else.
Exactly. You're playing on their perceptions, their fears.
That's fascinating.
Hmm.
And what's the third type?
That would be the small-scale diversion, sending in a relatively small force, almost like a raiding party, to cause disruption and sow chaos. But with this one, the key is a good exit strategy. You have to know when to cut your losses and pull back before the enemy catches on and traps you.
So every diversion needs a contingency plan, a way to disengage if things go south.
Absolutely. Always have an out. And there's one more crucial point Clausewitz makes about diversions. Every single one, no matter how well planned or well executed, inherently expands the theater of war.
Meaning?
You're inevitably pulling in new actors, new resources, new complexities that might not have been part of your initial calculations.
It's like you're setting off this chain reaction, right? You can control that initial spark, but after that, who knows what's going to happen?
Total chaos, maybe. Yeah. It's like that old saying about how no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that actually leads perfectly into what Clausewitz has to say about invasions, which is what he tackles in Chapter 21.
Okay, so let's talk invasions. Now, you might think that a military mind like Clausewitz, he'd be all about those bold, decisive strikes deep into enemy territory.
Right. Shock and awe. Go big or go home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it turns out he had a more, shall we say, nuanced view on the whole invasion thing.
He did. And to understand why, we need to think about how people back in Clausewitz's time, they used the term invasion pretty loosely. It was like its own separate category of warfare, the default setting for a campaign.
So they weren't necessarily thinking it through strategically.
Not always. It was more like, the enemy's over there, let's go get them, we'll call it an invasion. But Clausewitz, always the strategist, he challenged that thinking.
He wasn't about to just jump on the invasion bandwagon.
Exactly. And it goes back to that idea of adaptation we were talking about earlier. Clausewitz, he was adamant that warfare, you can't reduce it to neat little categories or some kind of predetermined checklist of strategies.
So no one-size-fits-all approach to invasions.
Definitely not. He said deciding whether to launch a deep invasion or stick to smaller, more contained engagements, it's not about following some rigid doctrine, some ancient playbook. It's about carefully sizing up the situation, the specific circumstances of that conflict, and then adapting your approach.
So forget the playbook. You're saying read the room, analyze the situation on the ground, and then make the smartest strategic call, even if it goes against, conventional military wisdom.
Precisely. And that's what's so brilliant about his thinking. It's timeless. Clausewitz knew that war, it's inherently unpredictable, right? Constantly shifting, never what you expect. A strategy that might have been brilliant in one situation could be a total disaster in another.
So how does that actually work in practice when we're talking about invasions? How do you know when pushing deep into enemy territory is the right call versus holding back, fortifying, and waiting for them to make a move?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Clausewitz, he doesn't give us a simple answer. There's no magic formula. But he does stress how important it is to understand the bigger picture. Don't just focus on troop movements or firepower. Analyze everything. Their political landscape, their society, even things like geography, how that might influence the course of the conflict.
So it's like he's saying, Don't just look at the battlefield itself, look at the entire ecosystem that battlefield exists in.
Exactly, because he wants strategists to really think through the consequences of their actions. Launching into a deep invasion might look good on paper, might sound good in the war room, but what happens next? Will it make the local population resist even harder? Could it even drag other powerful players into the fight, turn a border skirmish into a world war?
And then you got a whole different situation on your hands.
Right. Will it create a humanitarian crisis that undermines your whole objective in the first place? There are so many factors to consider.
So it's not just about military objectives then. It's about balancing those objectives against political, social, even moral considerations.
You've got it. And that's what makes it so complex, because how do you measure those factors? Can you even predict them? It's not like calculating how many tanks you need or the range of your artillery. This is about really understanding human nature, having a grasp of history, and being comfortable with uncertainty.
It sounds like Clausewitz is saying that being successful in war, especially when you're talking about something as massive as an invasion, it requires more than just being good at the tactical stuff. You need wisdom, even humility.
Absolutely. And honestly, how often do you see those qualities in a general, right? It's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment, the desire for a quick victory, more territory. But Clausewitz, he's reminding us that true mastery in warfare, it's about taking a step back, resisting that urge to rush into action, and really thinking things through.
Choose your battles. Know when to strike and when to hold back.
And sometimes the most strategic move is the one you don't make, the attack you don't launch.
It's about understanding that brute force isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's about having a deeper understanding of all the forces at play.
Well said. And that leads us to another key point Clausewitz makes in this chapter. War, when you really boil it down, is a human endeavor.
We tend to forget that.
It's fought with weapons, with technology, sure, but also with hearts and minds.
And even with all the advances in military technology we've seen since Clausewitz's time, even in the age of drones and cyber warfare and everything else, that human element, it hasn't gone away.
If anything, it's even more important now, given how complex the world has become. The decisions leaders make, the actions soldiers take, they all have consequences that reach far beyond the battlefield.
So much to think about, right?
Sure.
We've gone from these tactical diversions to like the massive undertaking of an invasion, and he's still bringing it back to those human decisions at human cost.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, the maps and the movements, but Clausewitz, he never lets us forget that ultimately it always comes back to people.
To how they react, what they value, the choices they make when faced with a threat.
Exactly. He's making the point that understanding your enemy, it's not just about knowing their troop numbers or what kind of hardware they've got. It's about getting inside their heads, what motivates them, what are they afraid of, even their culture, their history, all of that factors in.
Yeah. It's like that classic line, right? Know your enemy as you know yourself. But he's taking it even further, I think. He's saying you have to understand the entire board they're playing on, not just the pieces they're moving.
Absolutely. And honestly, that's such a critical takeaway for, well, really anyone in your line of work, even all these years after Clausewitz wrote those words. Because whether you're dealing with an actual nation state, some kind of non-state actor, or, let's be real, it's usually a messy mix of both these days.
The lines get blurry.
Exactly. Those human elements, they never go away. You have to factor them in.
It's like you're always playing multi-dimensional chess, right? Military strategy, it's not just about maps and troop movements. It's about this whole web of human relationships, perceptions, the potential for miscalculations.
And the consequences when those miscalculations happen, right? Which is why studying military history, digging into these classic texts like On War, it's so valuable, even for those of us who haven't actually worn the uniform.
It gives you that broader perspective.
It does. It lets us learn from the past, understand these timeless principles of strategy, and really grasp how profoundly warfare impacts societies. The human cost of it all.
It's about bridging that gap between theory and practice, taking those historical lessons and figuring out how they apply to the challenges someone in the field is facing today.
Exactly. And it's not just about memorizing dates and battles or trying to copy what worked before. It's about understanding the why, the context, and then asking yourself how those same principles might play out in our world right now.
But the battlefield's always changing. So as we wrap up this deep dive on Clausewitz, what are some of the key takeaways, some things our listeners might want to really think about, especially those grappling with these concepts in their own work every day?
Well, if I had to pick one thing that really stands out from Clausewitz, it's his emphasis on avoiding rigid thinking. Don't fall into that trap of assuming there's only one right answer, one right way to approach a challenge, whether we're talking diversions, invasions, really any aspect of strategy. Adaptability is essential.
Right, because clinging to some outdated playbook in a world that's changing faster than ever, that's asking for trouble.
It is. So being flexible, being able to adapt on the fly, that's always important. But in warfare, where the stakes are about as high as they get, it
Yeah.
can be the difference between success and failure.
Life or death, even.
Absolutely. And then building on that, I think Clausewitz's focus on understanding the context, that's so crucial. You can't make these decisions in a vacuum. The choice to use a diversion, to launch an invasion, even just to engage or withdraw from a particular area, it all has to be informed by what's happening on the ground. What are the motivations of everyone involved, not just your enemy? And then what are the potential ripple effects? You've got to try to think those through as best you can.
It's that whole butterfly effect thing, right?
Yeah.
What seems like a small action can have these huge unintended consequences.
Exactly.
So seeing the bigger picture is critical.
It is, and it's not easy, but it's necessary. And then finally, I think Clausewitz reminds us that true mastery in warfare, just like in any field, it requires more than just being good at the technical stuff. You have to understand human nature, because when you get right down to it, wars are fought and ultimately won by people.
And those people, on all sides, they're not just numbers on a battlefield. They have families, they have hopes and dreams, they have fears. And I think that's what Clausewitz is really getting at here.
He is. And to really grasp the true cost of conflict, you have to remember that human element.
It's a heavy thought, but an important one. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into Carl von Clausewitz's insights on diversions and invasions. We covered a lot of ground today, but if even a fraction of it resonated with you, if it got you thinking a little differently about these concepts, then I'd say we've done our job.
I agree. And for our listeners out there, keep asking those tough questions. Keep challenging your own assumptions. And never stop learning from the past because it can offer crucial insights for navigating the present.
Because in a world where the nature of warfare is constantly evolving, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding, that never really ends, does it?